One of the biggest areas that we place our focus on within the spiritual community, as well as the conscious community, is protection. Protection and shielding ourselves is one of the most common and universal themes that we all are concerned with. So today I'm going to be talking about the extra metaphysical benefits of discernment and how discernment protects one along their spiritual awakening journey. First, it's important to know that discernment is the complete opposite of judgment. In fact, we resort to judgment when we lack discernment. Judgment is rooted in our egoic and programmed self. It's not coming from our true intuition or clarity. It's not activating our holistic ability for intelligence. Discernment is when our intellect and our intuition have integrated and merged. So discernment is coming from an awakened state of being, whereas judgment is coming from predispositions, prejudice, fear, a need to feel superior or a sense of superiority, lack of information, or denial. So all of these distinct temperaments belong to judgment, and judgment is of our lower nature or our programmed self, whereas discernment is coming from our connection to our higher self. So when we're implementing more of our capacity for discernment, we're also reinforcing our connection with our higher self because we are practicing the attributes of our higher self. And by doing so, we link up with a feedback loop so that our higher self has a better direct connection to be able to inform us. So as we practice the way appears in front of us. And with this discernment is linking us to a higher plane of consciousness. Now that's important when it comes to protection because when we think of what we need protection from, we're typically thinking of things of a metaphysical nature, even though many of us fear very real and very tangible things that are strictly of a third-dimensional, physical nature. Typically, when we speak overall about this topic of protection, we're usually referring to it in a metaphysical sense, meaning we need protection from the metaphysical. And so discernment is the number one faculty that comes into play when we're speaking about this, whether we're talking about it from the third dimensional point of view or a higher metaphysical point of view. And that's because discernment works on both planes of consciousness. You could think of discernment as a cross. What happens is the more we incur and practice the faculty of discernment, what we're doing is connecting and linking more and more with our higher self. And by doing so, what that does is not just protect us on the physical plane, and how it would protect us on the physical plane is through preventative action. So we would have the discernment used in the capacity of foresight. And with the foresight, we're able to take measures before we have to get to a dire place with them. So in its most mundane and practical form, discernment is helping us navigate the third dimensional plane by making better choices with foresight so that we don't end up in dire situations with dire consequences. Now, how this works with discernment linking us with protection into the metaphysical plane is that as we are navigating the third dimensional plane, if we are not linked to our higher self, or if we are not linked to a higher plane, then what ends up happening is that we're only navigating this plane based off of the knowledge of the third dimension, meaning we don't have discernment or awareness of the higher planes of consciousness, be they of a positive or negative orientation. And so what's happening is that once we develop strong discernment, we start connecting with our higher self. And by doing so, now our higher self has more of an ability to help navigate us on that plane. So do you see how us practicing discernment on the third dimension is what aligns us with our higher self? And the reason it aligns us with our higher self is because discernment is an attribute of our highest self. So when we're practicing the higher attributes, we're now embodying our higher self. And through that practicing, Now we are connecting with the higher self, and our higher self, because it is just another form of saying our future self, is able to feed us resources into our experience in the past, aka this present moment. So the higher self now is able to, you could look at it as intervene, because there's a certain level of alignment that has been established. If feedback loops with the future is too woo, then you could also just look at the same concept as once you practice discernment, that's a higher vibratory level of consciousness. And when you have a higher vibratory level of consciousness, you are now incrementally raising your frequency. You can raise your frequency to meet your higher self or your future self in the middle. And by doing so, that anchors us into a higher level of consciousness, making the levels of consciousness that are vibrating below wherever our frequency is currently occupying no longer able to interact with us. So, in its most metaphysical sense, discernment acts as a huge protection and a barrier because we are no longer a vibrational match to certain consciousness levels, meaning certain realms, and what occupies those realms. This is also why it is so important when we are raising our vibration and therefore our frequency to be concerned with integrating our shadow and shadow aspects. It's because if we have blind spots that we are unconsciously operating from, then we're not able to access our full capacity for discernment because we're coming from a projection or we're coming from a denial or a fear. Any type of area that we aren't aware of within the self, now we have as an external barrier because it's blocking us from true discernment. So discernment is what protects us on multiple levels of reality. And yet discernment should not be equated with hypervigilance, because sometimes along our spiritual journey, we end up getting stuck in a state of hypervigilance and actually believe that that is us practicing discernment, and that's not. When we're in a state of hypervigilance, in fact, what that can do is end up drawing more experiences into our field and into our reality that are coming to confirm that we need to be hypervigilant. So it's a self-defeating prophecy, because what we're doing is when we're in hypervigilance and we're pretty much stuck in that mode is we're coming from paranoia. And paranoia is not discernment. Discernment also includes within it the ability to feel free and safe enough to be creative, to exert our free will. And when you're exerting your power and your free will, you're innately not in a state of hypervigilance. So even though discernment has clarity and intellect and the ability to filter whatever harmful information is coming through, it can filter it through the logic. It's still not coming from a state of a place of being of fear. Whereas paranoia and hypervigilance are coming from that level of consciousness. They're coming from a certain vibrational level. And in that level of reality, you can be a match to so many different experiences that come and confirm that you should be paranoid. And they also come and confirm that you need to be in a state of hypervigilance. Whereas discernment has this beautiful balancing act, this beautiful harmonic dance that it does, where we are incurring new information and it's not always going to be pleasant, and we're not shutting ourselves off to things that we need to learn to be aware of. So because we're not in denial of any negative aspects of this reality, and because we're not in denial of any positive aspects of this reality, we have this beautiful harmony where we're able to understand and hold more awareness. And by doing so, we're able to balance our actions and navigate better. So we're able to not only take preventative actions, we're also able to protect ourselves and assert ourselves with our own free will. Whereas when we're coming from a place of hypervigilance, what we're actually doing is just confirming our reality needs to be defended and protected. So with discernment, we have stronger psychic protection, but our attention is not hyper-focused on protection. And because of that, we have more quality of life, which allows for more creative freedom, which only breeds more sovereignty and more higher order thinking and capacity for higher order concepts. all of this is, you could think of like a spiral upward. Whereas if we think that we're coming from a place of discernment, we have used our logic to orient us into a state of paranoia and hypervigilance. Our nervous system actually is locked into that state and isn't developing a feedback loop with our higher self. So what we're doing is having confirmation bias from all of the experiences that we're having enter our field, rather than coming from a truly discerning space. Another way that discernment protects us is in the dreamscape. While we're asleep, our discernment acts like a barrier, like a force field, that doesn't allow in certain interactions or experiences because it's harnessing us, or it has anchored us into a certain level of being. And should our force field be breached, or an attempt to breach it, we are woken up by our discernment. So it acts in two different ways. It repels any type of interactions or experiences that are not a vibrational match, but then also we are woken up by the discernment and not allowed to follow through with anything that certain entities or certain experiences wanted to breach our realm for. So our level of discernment actually protects us from psychic attacks. Now, with all of this talk about discernment protecting us, the natural question that would arise is, how do we get discernment? We won't be able to acquire true discernment if we have no vested interest in awareness. So broadening our level of awareness is crucial to developing discernment. But then on top of that, what happens is that we learn about discernment through the trials and the tribulations of life. How else would we possibly know? And so because of that, reflection is a deeply vital process because it allows us to be able to gather information and deep understanding about our past experiences and our present experiences that all go towards the cultivation of discernment. So increasing our level of awareness is absolutely vital to cultivating discernment. After that, we have retrospection, because it's only by reflecting upon our past experiences can we learn from them and then apply that to the future. And then third, what we have is balancing our intellect with our intuition, because the intellect and the intuition fully merged and fused is what discernment truly is. So it's able to use both faculties, both our intellectual ability to use logic to be able to be practical and assess something, to see if it all adds up, and then also be brave enough to see if there's any plot holes, rather than fill them in ourselves with our own cognitive dissonance or our own blind spots. Logic will also ask us to engage our higher reasoning as well. So it's a certain level of critical thinking that is required on ourselves, as well as an ability for sincerity. That combined with our intuition, our ability to know things without fully knowing why, or sense things without fully being able to explain why we sense them. When these two faculties are fused together, where neither one is overpowering one another, but yet they're working together, what ends up happening is we're developing a feedback loop with our higher self, since the hemispheres of our body-mind are being integrated. The fourth and the most important way to cultivate discernment is to truly understand how important nuance is to awakening. Discernment would be incomplete without the capacity for nuance. In fact, discernment is the ability to recognize and apply nuance. Sometimes we have a problem with developing discernment because we intentionally block ourselves off from crucial awareness. This is because the crucial awareness would be a threat to our worldview in some way, like when it would mean we would have to accept that evil and evil intentions exist. When this happens, we cannot fully develop discernment because we are not able to conceive of anything outside of our level of consciousness. We cannot raise our consciousness if we are blocking off the very knowledge that would raise our frequency. So it becomes a vicious cycle. And yet, once we have raised our frequency to a certain threshold, nuance enters the equation and becomes the most important factor on our journey. It's what will allow us to recognize finer and finer distortions held within our inner world and the outer world. It will allow us to perceive what's in between the polarities of falsehood and true, good and evil, beneficial and destructive. And by doing so, it will allow us to navigate from a mature perception that is flexible and multifaceted. if judgment takes from our past experiences and superimposes them onto the present moment, verbatim, mechanically. Discernment learns from the past experiences. It applies those lessons to the present moment, but it also allows the present moment to be totally new and work in unknown ways. As long as we are in this reality, we will be learning discernment. No one is exempt from discernment or the journey of cultivating it. What happens is we allow the refinement process of our discernment to grow sharper and sharper to the best of our capacity and from what we have learned from our life experiences. And by doing so, we step further and further into our own spiritual sovereignty. I hope this has helped you further refine your discernment. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakenings. See you next time.